Well, welcome everyone. Happy Wednesday. It's great to see you all here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Adriana Link. I'm the head of scholarly programs at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Nancy Rubin Stuart, who is the author of Poor Richard's Women, Deborah Read Franklin, and the Other Women Behind the Founding Father. And we're really excited to have Nancy here today and to be partnering with the Carpenters Company for this talk. Let me just begin by acknowledging that the American Philosophical Society resides in what is now known as Philadelphia, which is in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. In recognizing this, the Society expresses its thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout this continent who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. Their generosity makes the work of the Society's Library Museum possible. For those of us who are joining for the first time and are unfamiliar with the APS, the Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to our membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, www.amphilsoc.org, and I'll put that in the chat to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
All right, thank you, Adriana. I'm Michael Norris. I'm the executive director of the Carpenters Company of the city and county of Philadelphia. We're happy to be co-hosting this event with our neighbors and friends at APS. If you're not familiar with the company, it was founded in 1724 as a trade guild for Philadelphia's master builders. The organization still exists today as a professional association for leading architects, builders, and engineers. In the early 1770s, the company built Carpenters Hall as its meeting space. And in the fall of 1774, we hosted the 56 delegates of the First Continental Congress, which set the stage for the Second Continental Congress and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Carpenters Hall is open to the public 6 days a week as a museum and historic site, and I welcome you all to come. Admission is free. While he was not a member of the Carpenters Company, Benjamin Franklin was a frequent presence at Carpenters Hall. The Library Company of Philadelphia, which Franklin founded in 1731, occupied the second floor of Carpenters Hall from 1773 to 1791. And in December of 1775, shortly after the revolution had started, Franklin and John Jay met in secret with an emissary from the French government at Carpenters Hall to begin discussing the possibility of France becoming our ally in the revolution. That eventually happened, as you probably know, and France's support was instrumental in helping us gain independence. Finally, in the 1780s, while Philosophical Hall was being built on Independence Square, APS housed its collection of scientific instruments in Carpenters Hall. And today, APS houses our most precious archives and records in their storage vault, and we continue to pursue partnerships and collaborations with them, like today. A few brief housekeeping rules before we get to our speaker. This session is being recorded and it will be shared with everyone who registered afterwards. Please keep your cameras off and your audio on mute to avoid distracting your fellow attendees and our speaker. And please type any questions you have in the chat. Kyle or Adriana, someone from APS, will be moderating the chat and fielding those questions to Nancy after the presentation. So with that, I will kick it back to Adriana, who is going to introduce our speaker today.
Great, thanks so much. So an award-winning author and journalist, Nancy Rubin Stuart, specializes in social history and women's history. Her earlier book, Defiant Brides, The Untold Story of Two Revolutionary Era Women and the Radical Men They Married, was a selection of the Book of the Month Club, the History Book Club, and Military Book Club. Her other acclaimed books include The Muse of the Revolution, The Reluctant Spiritualist American Empress Isabella of Castile, The Mother Mirror, and The New Suburban Woman. Nancy has also appeared on national television and has been interviewed on national radio, including NPR's Morning Edition. Her journalistic work includes the New York Times, Huffington Post, New England Quarterly, American History, Washington Post, as well as other national magazines. She also serves as the executive director of the Cape Cod Writing Center. Nancy, so happy to have you here and to learn more about this book.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk about Benjamin Franklin's women.
Great. So if you want to share your screen, I think we can get started.
Okay, great. So Benjamin, just take me a second to get there. Benjamin Franklin, really, he was attracted to women, very much so. But I must say that he found their attraction as shocking and dangerous as electricity itself. And this right from the beginning, as a young man, he was apprenticed to his older brother as a printer. Right from then, he wrote admiringly about women, including prostitutes in Boston. Anyway, but you all know Benjamin Franklin from a different side. You know him as the scientist and the statesman, the man who discovered that the importance of electricity in our environment, the man who was one of the signers of the Constitution. And you probably, at least popularly in history books, we know him as the person who had these very famous maxims that warned people to be cautious and to use reason over feeling. Here's just a few of them. I'm sure they're familiar to them. The honey is sweet, but the bee has a sting. Beauty and folly are old companions. Keep your eyes wide open before marriage, half shut afterwards. Do not dally with other folks' women or money. And of course, most of them came from his famous 1733 almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac. And, I just want to come back to these three that are sort of iconic for his advice about discretion in all matters. And that's what we think of him. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A stitch in time saves 9. Eat to live, don't live to eat. So this is sort of the popular view that we have of him. And of course, he's known throughout the world as a man of great reason, wisdom, thrift. And that's really what most people think about him when they hear the words Benjamin Franklin. As I said, even as a young man, he admired women so much. Here he is, he's still a teenager, he's 17, and he's writing in his brother's New England Courant, and he's admiring prostitutes and insisting that they were good for the economy and that they kept the shoemakers in business. Well, we won't go there now, but, right away. And of course, here's a tongue in cheek with everything. It's whimsical, but part of it's rather serious. He did, of course, flee in 1723 left his brother. He was furious with his brother, the way he was being treated and whipped as an apprentice. And he fled to Philadelphia. And in the beginning, this is his wife, Deborah Read. In the beginning, the first time he saw her, at least according to his autobiography, he was in the autumn of 1723. He arrived disheveled because he was a runaway. He was a runaway apprentice, dirty from many days of traveling, starving, and he was walking down Market Street. And he was eating one roll, and he had 2 others, eating it ravenously. He had 2 others under his arm, and he said that she giggled at him. Well, maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But anyway, some months later, much later in 1724, by then he had a job with a sort of a cranky printer, one of the few in Philadelphia, named Keimer. And when he came back, his trunk had come with his clothes, and he came to Deborah's father, John Reed, who was a carpenter. And he asked to board there. And Deborah was amazed, or at least that's what Ben tells us in his autobiography. And he said, by then, he said, I made a much more respectable appearance in the eyes of Miss Read. And so things went on. He was sort of, because he was a talented printer, and that news got around town, there was a sort of an unscrupulous lieutenant governor who wanted to set him up as a printer. And there's a whole series of things that Ben falls for. And he goes to back to Boston to plead with his father for money to set up this print shop. He's now 18 years of age. And of course, his father says no, and he comes back. But meanwhile, he had made, as he put it,
Nancy, I'm sorry for interrupting. We're
Sure.
actually seeing your presenter view, not the actual slideshow.
Oh, how terrible, really.
So I'm wondering if you can make a little adjustment on that.
Okay, what can I do here? Presenter view. Why aren't we seeing that? Let me go back. So
I think you might need to end that and then
start again.
And start again. Sorry about that. And we're getting a little frenzy of comments in the chat.
Well, I can see it very well.
Yeah, people can't see the full slide.
Now I can't see it at all. Okay. I cannot see it at all. Is anyone seeing it?
No, it looks like your desktop. Okay, maybe we should share again.
Well, I can't even, okay. I can't even find I can't even find it right now. I don't know what's happened.
If you want, I can run the slides and you can just tell me to advance to the next slide. Okay, let me.
I think you better, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Just give me 1 second.
All right.
So why don't you keep going and you can tell me where to go.
So we're back to Deborah. And Deborah, he courts Deborah, and he said, I had great respect and affection for her. And I had some reason that she felt the same for me. Unfortunately, at that point, he was soon afterwards, her father died. And so her mother, Sarah, who ran an ointment business, a rather good one, said to them, it's not a good idea for you to get married. You're too young. And moreover, Ben was about to go to England on the promise of this governor, Lieutenant Governor, Sir William Keith. So he made promises to Deborah. They exchanged letters. He would soon be with her. You can go forward, Ariana, back to Deborah. Deborah believed him, but soon afterwards, after he was in England for a little while, of course, he found out Sir Keith had not promised and not funded or even had his friends fund anything, and he found he had to get a job rather quickly. But he was dazzled by London, and he and his friend sort of gallivanted around. His friend couldn't find a job, so Ben was supporting them both in a place called Little Britain. And finally, Ben even made a pass to his friend's girlfriend for a while. And he said he attempted intimacies with her, but she repulsed him with a proper resentment, and that ended the friendship. But anyway, by then he had already written to Deborah and said that he didn't think he'd be back for a long time. And he calls it, using a printer term, he says that this was a great errata of my life. Well, Deborah was heartbroken. And Deborah is about 17 at this point, and her mother, I should say, a widowed mother, prevails on her to not waste time and to really welcome other courters, other suitors, and she does. And so finally, not too long afterwards, in the summer of in August of 1725, she marries an English man who is a potter at Christ Church in Philadelphia. And the marriage doesn't last very long because she soon discovers he's actually married and has a child in England. And of course, that ends it, and she refuses to have his name anymore, and she is desolate. And there she's in a strange position because eventually he does run off with her dowry, and he does lose money and whatever his escapades were. But she's divorce was extremely rare at that time in early 18th century Pennsylvania. She couldn't get divorced. And moreover, eventually he flees to the West Indies, we think Barbados. So she's neither married nor divorced. She's in a terrible situation. And somebody who was sociable as she was and warm and outgoing, and by the way, was already, I think, a sort of a promising businesswoman. She must have helped her mother with her ointment business, because we know she's quite astute. She becomes what we would call today a bookkeeper with finances. But she is no longer happy. She's withdrawn. All of her friends are now married and maybe even having children. And she's very much sort of a totally different person than when Ben had left her. Well, Ben eventually comes back. There's a series of adventures in London, comes back to England, and after returning to work with Keimer, his original printer, he eventually leaves that, is insulted, and starts a business with another friend. And he and the friend go on with this business, but the friend is an alcoholic. And so by 1730, Ben has bought him out, so to speak, and he is running the beginning of his B. Franklin printer shop. And he has been courting other women. And I should mention, we don't know exactly when, because Ben had a way of sort of glossing over certain important emotional issues in his life. But at some point, and I don't know what's in England, I don't know whether it was back here in the colonies, but he began to associate with low women. And he said he was very lucky. He didn't have any danger to himself, his health, or any inconveniences. Well, the latter wasn't quite true. So 1730, he has come back often to talk to Mrs. Franklin and Deborah and other people in her family. And he says he gives them advice. It's probably some kind of financial advice for Mrs. Read, the Deborah's mother. And he sees how in a terrible shape his former fiance is, and he feels very guilty about that. And finally, he in August of 1730, he proposes to her. Now, there's a lot of books and theories that have been written. Historians have waxed eloquent on did he marry her because he was still in love with her, or was he ever in love with her? I mean, he knew in the beginning she had a dowry. Franklin being practical, he knew that this was a suitable person. He tried to win the hands of other women before he proposed to Deborah again this second time. And the fathers would have no part of it. As he put it, printers made very little money, and they didn't want a poor provider for their daughter. So 1730, August, he proposes to Deborah. And Deborah accepts. And on September 1st, as he writes, I took her to wife. Now, that's a common law marriage. Could not be a church ceremony. She was neither married nor divorced, but technically married to somebody else. So it would have been bigamy. And there was some fear that she would be responsible for her former husband's debts, because there were debts left in the colonies before he fled south to the West Indies. So nevertheless, they prevailed. Now, as I say, historians wonder, was he a man of passion? Did he love her? Was he in love with her? Well, the stories that he writes about in his autobiography about all the other women he courted before her, I don't know. I have doubts. And there's another pressing reason, because about 6 months after they're married, he arrives home with a squirming bundle, and inside of it is a young child. We can go to the next slide, Ariana. Yes. And it is a little baby boy. Now, we don't know the exact name. Again, there's a lot of theories as to when exactly he was born. But we do know he was a very young child, whether he was newborn, whether he was a year or two old. There are books written on this. His name was William, and Deborah was aghast. This man who she knew was, involved with good principles and healthy living and good morals, and had preached all of this and had engaged in his own self-improvement schemes and written out, whole treatises on it. And here he was. He obviously had been with low women. Well, maybe they weren't low women. One theory of one historian is that he had been involved with somebody whose husband was out of town, maybe at sea or whatever, because he claimed this child. If he had been dallying with prostitutes, of course, the argument would have been who knew whose child that was, but he claimed this child. So perhaps that theory is good. The child was named William, and Deborah balked at first. She did not want to raise him. I mean, she's 19, 20 years of age. She doesn't want to raise somebody else's child, and certainly child born under these circumstances, but she does out of her, quotes, tender love for her husband. So she raises him. We can go to the next slide, please. And this child is William Franklin, who eventually becomes the governor of New Jersey, and eventually does not support the American Revolution. But anyway, Deborah, and so the three of them are involved in a household with, by the way, Deborah's mother also living there at that point. And Deborah takes over the stationery shop soon after she's married, and she turns it really into, she expands the goods, and she begins to show her bookkeeping and her businesswoman mettle. She imports all kinds of and orders all kinds of goods, and it becomes a general store and quite prosperous. And meanwhile, Ben is working in his print shop, and Ben is very proud of her. In his autobiography, he says that she proved a good and faithful helpmate, and she assisted me much by attending the shop. And he later says, we throve together and we were mutually endeavored to make each other happy. And thus I corrected that great erratum as best as I could. Well, the marriage goes on. Deborah it's 2 years till she finally becomes pregnant and births a little boy who they called Frankie. And Franklins are ecstatic about him. I guess he was very bright and lively and quite promising. And there's a lot written that Franklin does actually. When Deborah is in the last stages of her pregnancy, he begins to write his almanac, his famous almanac. And of course, everyone had an almanac then. It was not just the stars and the days of the week and current information about the tides, but also in his case, and predictions about weather. It was a greatly expanded compendium of the famous slogans, some of which we know. And he had a character named Richard Saunders, who was sort of his avatar, and had in humor a long-suffering wife. Well, Deborah and Franklin and Ben were very happy at first, it seems. I have to laugh, though, because in the beginning, he writes, 6 weeks they're married, he writes about rules for promoting matrimonial happiness. And of course, the gist of it is the woman should be subservient and she should obey her husband. Of course, she should be faithful and proper and so on. But within a couple of years, he writes something else in the Pennsylvania Gazette, his newspaper. And that is that he is justifying, well, Deborah's thorny side. Deborah's has a thorny side, and he writes about the good things about a scolding wife. We're sure it's based somewhere on his personal experience. And he boasts how a scolding wife is a spirited woman, and she is a great energy, and she produces strong and vibrant children. And of course, at this point, it certainly looks like little Frankie is just that. Unfortunately, despite Ben's warnings in the Pennsylvania Gazette about smallpox in Boston and then ravaged through Philadelphia on many occasions, that without inoculation, which was a primitive form, obviously not with a needle, but rather scraping the pus from an infected person into the arm or the leg of somebody who could be, who would benefit from the virus. They might be sick for a few days, but mostly they recovered. But Ben didn't do that with his son, because his son at age almost 4 was sick with dysentery. And to his incredible sorrow and Deborah's, of course, Ben writes more about his sorrow than Deborah's. The son dies, Frankie dies. So suddenly comments in the almanac about the wonders of pregnant women. He's written a number of them where he rejoices and sings of pregnant woman that he enjoyed as much as seeing a woman, as much as seeing a ship in full sail. 7 years go by in which Deborah labors very hard in the store and probably doing a lot of the books. And we know from the American Philosophical has copies in the ledger books of many of Deborah's notations. So we know that she was quite involved. And quite a few years go by before she finally has a daughter, Sally, in 1743. But meanwhile, Franklin has become incredibly well-to-do. He begins to branch out. The Gazette is popular. He soon is developing paper mills in other places, and even has several branches of the Gazette with other people. He has apprentices who, and by the way, some talented men from England to come and help and assist him. So by 1740, he's quite well-to-do, quite prosperous. I should also mention that in 1737, he becomes clerk of the Assembly. And you know, one of Ben's most important goals is civic well-being. And he is determined to make Philadelphia the best city in America, the leading city where great institutions will be formed. And of course, it's already beginning to become the most industrious and active port-wise city in very, very prosperous by the 1740s in America, in colonial America. So he is finally appointed in 1737, as I say, to the post office postmaster in Philadelphia, and Mrs. Deborah pitches in and helps him with that also. So 1740s, he is a wealthy man, and he becomes politically active. Meanwhile, you know, right from the beginning, he has courted men who also like to read. He's insisted on the beginnings of lending libraries. He forms a group called the Junto, where men, not only in Philadelphia, but elsewhere throughout, because of his experience as a postmaster, he can communicate with people all over the country and in Europe with the latest scientific and intellectual pursuits. In 1743, has already been mentioned, he forms the beginning of what would become the American Philosophical Society. But these people, some of them were tradesmen in the beginning, but these people eventually become some of the prime movers and shakers in Philadelphia that help raise the city. He has many other schemes. I won't go into them because we don't have the time. But there are, just mentioned, fire department, paving the streets, starting a university, and many, many other endeavors. But he also is concerned about the civic well-being. And there are some disturbing things. There's the inevitable wars that continue in Europe that come over to this country. And among them are the War of the Austrian Succession, is King George's War, and the 7-Year War. And there's a great deal of upheaval and concern about the French invading the ports south of Philadelphia. And Franklin organized, there is, of course, a Quaker city, which Philadelphia is, or was primarily. They were many of the leading people in the assembly. And they believe in nonviolence, and he is very much concerned about an invasion of Philadelphia. And because he is so well known, both as a publisher and a civic leader, he helps to form a militia. Now, that's very upsetting to the proprietors of Pennsylvania, the Penns. Going back to William Penn's charter, 1681, but his son Thomas and the heirs don't have as much care for the well-being and the liberties of the residents of Pennsylvania. It's a royal charter that he has. It's not like the other colonies. So Thomas Penn and his brother and are really the people who have more power, let me say, than the assembly. And this is a source of ongoing friction. So when these threats of invasion come, Penn is not willing to contribute or to pay taxes to help defend. So that is why Ben organizes a militia. And Thomas later, of course, this conflict ends. But Thomas Penn in England says, you have to watch out for him. Franklin is a dangerous man, and he would do more to destroy him, but he's so popular that he really can't. So that is ongoing. And Ben finally is elected to the assembly. I think it's in 1751. So he had been the clerk of the assembly before that for many years. So now he's elected to it, and he's politically, many of his accomplishments have become realities, not all of them, but he's well known. And soon he is appointed to become the deputy colonial postmaster of the colonies. And he does a great deal to change with his cohort from Virginia to change the primitive system of mail. I mean, he puts in things like the dead letter office. He speeds up the mail. He changes a lot of the really primitive ways that mail was getting delivered. There's a whole complex of payments and credits and so on that he simplifies that. And Deborah is by his side helping him. And they say eventually she was the one who could change. She was the one who knew best how to change Barbados currency and there was a great deal of trade that went on. She was the one who was able to do this. So Ben is touring throughout the colonies, but I want to back up for a moment. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. He loves his wife, or so he says. He has already celebrated her in a poem. He was one of the founding members of the Masons in Philadelphia, and he celebrated her as his plain country Jane, who was so thrifty, maybe not beautiful, but really made such a difference. And that's 1743, I think it's 43. 1741 to 42. And now 1745, he writes this really hilarious essay called Old Mistresses Epilogue, or as it's been called also, Advice to a Friend on Choosing a Mistress. And the gist of it is that he should, if he has a young single friend who isn't getting married, he should prefer an old woman to a young one. He doesn't mean old. He means what we would think of as middle-aged today. Now, maybe this is bawdy writing, B-A-W-D-Y. Maybe this was just more of his humor. And maybe it wasn't. We don't know. The scholars, in any case, kept this hidden for over 200 years until the early 20th century, when it was finally revealed. So that and some other writings that he did, including one about a woman who kept bearing illegitimate children, and that the courts shouldn't be putting her in jail. They should be rewarding her for helping to populate the colonies. So, yes, I guess he's defending illegitimate children, because certainly he got a lot of hostility and horror, and it was used to taunt him that he had an illegitimate son, William. But anyway, 1750. Let's move ahead now. 1754. He is on a tour improving post offices. He's in New England. He'd been in New York, and now he's in New England, and he's visiting with one of his brothers, John. And while he's there, he meets a relative through marriage, a young woman named Catherine Reed. He calls her Katie. And there's a great deal of great deal that's been written about this. Ben is now 49, and Katie is 23, and she's lovely and smart and fascinated. Ben has by now, of course, already, I should just say, and we won't dwell on it, he has become internationally famous for what he has done with electricity and the lightning rod. So he's internationally revered, he's known, and so he's very famous. And Katie is absolutely overwhelmed by him and charmed by him, and is only, Ben could do this better than anybody. And they have a delightful sort of flirtation. And then she has to go back to her home in Block Island. And he offers to accompany her, to escort her back to the port, well, to Rhode Island, from where she'll sail, with Katie and Ben. There is a Mr. Post. We don't know whether this is the person, the driver, the carriage driver, or who, and another relative, a female relative. And we don't know whether they stay throughout the whole carriage ride, whether the other relative leaves. It seems as though she leaves ahead of time. Rhode Island historian has calculated that ride in those days had to take at least 2 days. So they had to stay over somewhere. And the historians have had, some speculation about where did they stay. I have too. Where did they stay and how did they stay? And why do we care? Well, we care because they have destroyed a lot of their letters, but there are a lot of letters that indicate he certainly was infatuated with her and she was infatuated with him. And there are many, many letters, but I've just put this one up in which he returns later home and he says, "You promised to send me kisses in the wind. Your favors come with the snowy fleece, which are as pure as your virgin innocence, white as your lovely bosom, and as cold." And it's cold. And, he also wrote to her at some point in many of these letters, and they admit they destroyed some of them. We know that there's parts that were destroyed because she was embarrassed about some of them ultimately. And he has offered to teach her, quotes, multiplication, but she has refused. So, Ben, the point is that Ben is known as a man of reason, a man who always thinks about the best. But with women who he admired, it looks like he certainly gets carried away and that passion overrules prudence. And this is just one more example. We can cite the others going way back to, his low women. We can go back and look at William's birth and so on. But anyway, this is a theme that fascinated me and one of the reasons that I continue to research and ultimately write this book. So we can then go on to the next slide, please. So Ben is, I say, politically involved in the assembly and quite well respected. There are some, again, the Penns aren't contributing. They are not paying any taxes. They're not helping at all with some of the problems at the frontier near the Ohio River Valley. And so it's very distressing because there are settlers there. And there are a lot of invasions and deaths and slayings and bloodshed. And ultimately, the English send over General Braddock and his troops, and Ben and his son, by then a grown man, tried to help them, collecting wagons and equipment and so on and so forth. Braddock doesn't listen. Braddock is ultimately killed. This is the beginning of the French and Indian War, and things are pretty bad. And Ben writes a lot of inflammatory information, news, essays about the massacres, and he implicates, and you begin to see these flashes of temper, which politically, we see them here and there scattered throughout, but this is one in which he really speaks out about them. And they're terrible, by the way, treatment of all Native Americans, including many peaceful ones. There are many different tribes involved in this. So things are pretty bad and the assembly is up in arms, and the Quakers aren't doing much to support and fight them back. And there's a lot of friction, major tensions. And it is that point, we're looking at 1757 now, where Ben is asked to go to England as an agent to plead with the Penns to do their part in protecting their royal charter. He's even suggesting, and he does much more so later, that they simply get rid of this royal charter and let them become a regular colony, like, well, almost all of the other colonies at that point. But he, of course, wants Deborah to go with him, and he asks her to go. Deborah refuses. And we don't know why. Again, the theories abound. Deborah that one theory is that when she came over as a very young child in 1711, it was a harrowing journey. Those journeys in the early 18th century were terrible, dangerous, filthy, disease-ridden, subject to pirates and shipwrecks. This is not made up. It's what really was. And she remembered this terrible journey as a very young child, and she refused to go. Theories abound about why. Yes, that was one theory, maybe because by now, of course, Ben has long since retired, and she is living, she still is taking care of people. She's nursing people. She's entertaining hordes of relatives, most from Franklin's family. She is probably not running the store anymore because she doesn't need to, but she is still taking care and helping with the finances. And Ben had actually said to William Dunlop, who was to take over the postmastership, you'd better listen to Mrs. Franklin, because she has a great deal of experience in the management of the post office, and I depend on you for paying considerable attention to her advice. So, all right. So there's quite a tumult between the two Franklins, and she refuses to go. Now, she also has a certain social standing at this point. She's very well known throughout Philadelphia. She's highly respected. Not only was she co-postmistress or deputy postmistress, but many years in the store. And she's has socialized with some of the elite in Philadelphia. She has a certain standing. So she, that's another theory, which I think is important, that she has a place. One of the terrible theories, the misogynist theories about Deborah, is that, of course, she is ignorant, she's provincial, she's dumpy. She would never stand up to scrutiny in the cultured life of London, the people that Ben would be socializing with. I don't know, nobody does. But I go with the fact that this was really not only somebody maybe did fear the journey, but had her own place. In any case, Ben leaves, and he resides in London in a townhouse at what was then 36 Craven Street, was now 36 Craven Street. And he resides with a middle-class widow named Margaret Stevenson. And Margaret is about the same age as he, and by the way, rather similar to Deborah in many of her characteristics. She's warm, she's social, but she can be prickly. But she immediately takes care of Ben, more than just as a lodger. Ben becomes ill from the smoky air in London. She takes care of him. She advises him on his wardrobe. She introduces him to friends. She ingratiates him, not that he needed it. And one of his friends, because he had friends already in England, not only through correspondence, but also from memories from the first trip in England. And he's also involved as, obviously, Dr. Franklin, the distinguished scientist. So they begin to operate like a couple. And that's what their friends and associates, without saying anything, think of them. We don't know exactly. And we don't have a picture of Mrs. Stevenson, but we do know that one of Ben's friends writes to Deborah and says that he thinks she'd better come over to protect her interests. It's an exact quote. And there are other women who would sail twice as far across the Atlantic to be with Ben because he's so very popular. But Deborah refuses. So this trip is supposed to only take 6 months or a year. It turns out to be 5 years. And we don't have Deborah's letters. We have a few little scraps of letters, a few little accountings. We have his letters to her, and we're able to sort of divine some things from it, but we don't have hers to his. He didn't keep them, or they were lost at sea, or whatever. And that was very disappointing. But, Deborah has maintained everything the way he wants it at home. He's constantly giving orders, and she maintains it, and she continues to raise Sally, who he wants Sally to be religious and pure and moral and humble and thrifty above all. And meanwhile, next slide, please, Ariana. Yes, I want to come back to this about Deborah. There's terrible views of her throughout history. As I said, this dumpy, ignorant, provincial, stupid woman And you can see from her, here's some examples of her spelling from some of her later letters. And you can see that they're very difficult to read because she was never taught spelling, which, by the way, really wasn't taught to middle-class girls at that point. They needed to read and write, maybe compute, but they didn't need to spell because they were to be involved in the home. So we can move on to and you'll see that this is a smart woman. You can see just that second comment under my dear child, that Adam Strudel, that's the second sentence, has bought these houses at a third more than they are worth. Indeed, I wouldn't give half above what he has for them. And of course, the letters between them, which is curious, are always very affectionate. She says, I am as ever your affectionate wife. And they address these letters to each other as my dear child, which I think is sort of like we would say, hi, sweetie, or hi, baby, between loving spouses. Next slide, please. Well, Margaret Stevenson has a daughter, Paulie, and Paulie is a young woman intensely fascinated by Franklin's learning and is constantly asking him to explain things. And he eventually sort of adopts her as his surrogate daughter. In fact, the family, the Stevensons, become sort of his surrogate English family, and he makes no bones about it. And he's much more giving and warm and affectionate, frankly, to Paulie, as she was known, than he is in his letters and interchanges with Sally, his daughter. Next slide, please. These are strange things that Charles Wilson Peele is a young artist, come to England and lodge briefly at the Stevensons. And he opens the door one day to Stevenson's townhouse, and he finds this is later in 1768, and he finds he's embarrassed by what he sees, Franklin with another woman. Next slide, please. And some of them are obviously, well, rather racy. And he rushes back to his room and he sketches them out. So who was this? It wasn't Mrs. Stevenson. We don't think it wasn't. We don't think it was Paulie. We don't know. So the reputation that Franklin has in the popular mind, the other reputation is a womanizer. There may very well be some truth to that. Shall we next slide, please? Okay, actually, let's go back one more. So in England, he comes back in 1763, and Deborah's very happy to see him. Sally is now a young woman. Nevertheless, he is pining to be back in England, and he keeps writing to his friends. He wants to do that. And he writes to them, and he says he finds that petty island, when compared to America, is more sensible, vigorous, and elegant than we collect in 100 leagues in our forests, in our vast lands. And Deborah is horrified. He even sends letters, which he doesn't put in his copybook, to Mrs. Stevenson, and sends gifts. But anyway, finally, in 1765, things are obviously heating up with the American Revolution, and we still have the pen problem. And once again, he is sent over to England to try to reason with the pens and also to soothe what are hostile and outrages and riots and the Sons of Liberty and the Patriots and the colonies beginning to unite against the British oppressive acts, of which there are many. And once again, Ben pleads with Deborah to go. And she doesn't. And he must say to her, we don't have that letter, that she must, if he's going to stay, she must not complain. So she tries to be cheerful all the time in her letters. And sadly, very sadly, Sally marries. That's one of Deborah's independent streaks, because Ben didn't want this man, Richard Bache, who she married, who was an impoverished merchant, but he does. She does, and he remains in England until 1775. And in the meanwhile, Deborah, health begins to fail. She has a stroke, and she has another stroke. And the letters now between them, which I was so glad when I finally got her voice in that second voyage, that she is lovely, warm, smart. Knows everything about the community, sort of a spokesman for Franklin, is taking care of many of his financial things. She seems to do a good job until she becomes ill. She has 2 strokes. She dies. And the letters are heartbreaking at the end because she keeps writing to him that she needs him. And she writes that at the end, after her first stroke, she writes that she wasn't sick. The stroke didn't come from a sickness, but from too much disquiet of mind. And I wish it were your power to come home. How I long to see you. He keeps putting her off. He's obviously very involved with trying to make peace or resolve the issues between the Americans and Parliament, and it's not happening well. And he becomes panicked, and he writes her many letters at the end, and she dies in December of 1774. We can go on to the next slide, please. He returns to America, to Philadelphia, and he is here for a number of years, 2 years. He signs the Declaration of Independence. He's involved in the Congress, and he's involved in many other duties. Trying to watch my time here, but he does eventually get back as a minister, one of 3, commissioner, to France. He gets to France in 1778, 79. He is really the prime mover for the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance, which enables France to provide funds to the struggling new nation. He meets, of course, a charming woman. We don't know whether this is really her portrait. It's certainly been disputed, but she was a beautiful young musician married to a nobleman. And she was so famous as a pianist, which was the new pianoforte, that Boccherini devotes his 6th sonata to her. And they have a passionate love affair. She's married to a wealthy older man, a loveless marriage. This poor gal, she continues to regale him with love, declarations of love. She invites him regularly to dinners. They play chess together, sometimes with her in the bathtub. Yes, with a plank over her. I guess that was fashionable. But she will not give him the last favor. And there are over 100 letters between them. It's absolutely charming and frustrating that she flirts with him. She says she sits on his knee in public, but it's really a tease, and I think she's ambivalent. So it's very frustrating. And once again, we see Ben is given away. He's involved, of course, politically very heavily in France all the time. But we see that once again, he has given himself over in an so-called uncharacteristic way to passion rather than prudence. And next slide, please. She ultimately rejects the last favor, and soon enough, he's involved with a widow, an unconventional one at that, who was a famous salon hostess, but was sort of a free spirit. And she lives nearby in OT in another village. And she, again, flirts with him sort of shamelessly. And she loves him. She makes comments like, I have the greatest desire to see you and embrace you. But she catches on to his roving eye, I guess, even though he's in his 70s. And she says to him, well, what happened to your shoulder? Was it by chance a rheumatism caught under the window of one of my rivals? So, she understands him, and he finally begs her to marry. And she refuses. And this goes on for months. And finally, he becomes so passionately insistent, almost violent, that she flees to Tours. Thereafter, they become friends. And we don't have time for me to go into it, but there's some very funny and amusing things that happen, including Abigail Adams' horror at this unconventional woman at her estate. But we're going to run out of time. So I just want to say both of these women, both of these French women, and Deborah in her own way, really had declared independence in a way from Ben. And yet Ben, continued to certainly long after these women, even though he knew it was politically or personally, really not practical at all. So I just want to say one of Ben's favorite maxims was, if passion drives, let reason hold the reins. And but I think those instincts were the private struggle of the founding fathers' life. And you might also ask, when you look at this book, Ben, Poor Richard's Women, what is the purpose of this book beyond sort of the prurient, yes, Ben is involved with women? But I think there are a number of hints beneath his veneer of calm reason that when faced with crisis, and there are many, and politically we see them, he's written really here and there, he flames some of his political writings, and he wishes the pens were gibbeted up as they deserve to rot and stink in the nostrils of posterity. And he wrote to Arthur Penn in the letter he never sent that he had a sick mind, which is forever tormenting others with his jealousies. And of course, his coldness, even when his son, many years later, the disloyal son, begs for forgiveness, he expects to collect loans, the payment for loans for him. So, okay. So my feeling is that his treatment of women is really a portal into the man that tries very hard to retain a certain public image, and that's the image that's come down in history books. But there's much more to him, that he's very much a flawed human being, like ourselves. And many of his flirtations with women enabled good things to happen, not only thrift with Deborah, but also with the French warmth and embrace and political socialization that they provided. One, in fact, Madame Brillon, the younger woman, actually had a key through her acquaintance. It eased the ultimate British treaty with the colonies, with the United States. But I just want to say that if passion drives, let reason hold its reins. I don't think he fulfilled that all the time. And that's why I wrote the book. And I hope that I've revealed that he advised that as much for himself as for the rest of us. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nancy. So glad. Sorry for missing the introduction. My service ran long. So welcome, everyone. We've got some time for questions, and I invite everyone to use the chat function. If I can take the first question. So you've had a distinguished authorial career, and we are, of course, on the second day of Women's History Month.
Yes.
So I wonder if we could just start maybe sort of big picture. How does this book fit into the other works that you've done? You know, is this a book that you could have written at the start of your career, or is this a book that really has come, is the culmination in some ways of the work that you've done up to this point?
I think the latter, Kyle. I began as a journalist many, many years ago, too many to tell you. And the first two books were journalistic, but they also began to involve women's history. And yes, I think that I couldn't have written this book many years ago, although I have to tell you, 26 years ago, I started this book and I put it away several times. I mean, nobody at that time was just on Deborah, and nobody cared about Deborah. It was like, oh, this stupid, dumpy woman. We don't want her. So, thank goodness to things have changed. Time has changed. Women history is now much more important and respected and revealing. And digitization. Many of these letters I was able to obtain through the digitization in the Library of Congress of the Yale paper, the Franklin papers, the Yale and American philosophical, I should say, papers. So yes, long answer, but yeah, I don't think I could have written this a long time ago.
Well, we are glad that that project that started 25 years ago has come to fruition, and we did put the link in the chat for where folks can go ahead and order a copy. Great question here from Mackenzie Warren. Why were women willing to engage with a married man? And, what are the dangers of reading Franklin through our 21st century values, right? Was the 18th century a different time period, especially around, what you've been describing, especially maybe in the later part of his life of these relationships with women when he...
Can I jump in? Because that was my question.
Sure, go ahead, Nancy.
So the reading it from a 21st century perspective was not part of my question. And I'm going to stick up for that as a women's historian as well. The reason I asked why were women willing to engage with a married man, thinking about the cultural context behind these engagements. So from an 18th century point of view, when we have these relationships that could be deemed as political, like we see in France for him, that part of the political conversation between men and women was flirtatious. When you're in the colonies, what is, a benefit of engaging with someone on that level? And additionally in London, what was the cultural context for these upper class rich women who were already married to engage in any sort of potentially dangerous, potentially adulterous relationships with Benjamin Franklin?
Well, I think, Franklin was the only places we have where he engaged for sure with married women is in France. And by then he's a widower. So there's that. And there's a big difference. And of course, there's a lot written about Franklin really wasn't serious in any of these flirtations. It was kind of a game, and the game that was played particularly in France. In the colonies, certainly the idea, and Martha Saxon did quite a did a book on this. Women were considered had to be good. You have sort of in New England, the Puritan legacy and so on. But people were people, just like they are today. 50% of all, it's been estimated, 50% of all colonial women were pregnant by the time they got married. So, I think people were people. They were just like they are today. And it really wasn't that much different, although the veneer and the proper thing, maybe what would have been the mainstream and would have been propriety. I hope that answers your question without getting too technical and too long. I know there are other questions.
Thank you, Nancy. Michael, would you like to turn your camera on to ask your question, or would you like me to ask it?
Oh, you can ask it.
Okay, thank you. So did you look into, Nancy, did you look into his relationship with his sister Jane, Jane Franklin Miko?
Yes, I did, but only to a certain point, because obviously Jill Lepore has done a spectacular job of that. But I didn't, I was more interested in his quotes, romantic and close, intimate relation. He was wonderful to Jane, although they had their differences for sure. But the short answer is only yes, only as a point of reference, deliberately left out.
Okay. And and Jill Lepore's book is a wonderful resource as well. I think it's really great that our library shelves are expanding now with these wonderful works that really give us a new view into Franklin. So Eric Rugert asks, is it possible these French women were simply spies and Ben's libido a clever cover for espionage?
That is we certainly hear a lot about spies and Benjamin Franklin in France all the time. He's absolutely paranoid about spies and knows, by the way, who some of those spies are. I don't personally don't think so. It's certainly possible, but I don't think so. They not from everything that I've read and not everything that I can understand, but there were many spies, and both men and women. But he was a pretty shrewd judge of character, and so I'm going with that.
Sounds good. So Larry Ties asks, could Nancy say some more about the outcomes of Benjamin Franklin's relationships with both Margaret and Paulie Stevenson?
Thank you, Larry. Yes. Well, when Margaret, he was extremely close to Margaret, and there is speculation that that they had a romantic relationship, period, that he lived there. And he does admit many times that, and he writes after she dies, that his years with her were among the happiest in his life. There's also speculation about his relationship with Paulie, and Paulie adored him. He becomes his English daughter, so to speak. She eventually marries, and after she is widowed, he still tries to take care of her. There are lots of speculation about maybe it was Paulie that he was romantically involved in, but I don't think so. I'm pretty certain it was Margaret. So, and some really terrible things for Deborah to hear, what he writes about Margaret. And he says, this is the greatest woman in England. And she thinks those goods that you sent, the food or the goods, of the best she's ever had. I mean, how insulting to Deborah. Wasn't she the best woman in colonial America? I mean, so, there's a lot of air around all of this. But my view is that it was with Margaret, and that he had a sort of a stepfatherly attitude, adored Paulie. But that's my view.
So we have a nice question here from, probably going to pronounce this wrong, Raisamukamo. Did you happen to research Anne Rosalie Bouquet Filuel? I might have butchered that pronunciation, but.
I did look at, yes, of course, before I went on with, but I had to limit the book in a certain way. So I didn't, yes, and there's been some written about that and a lot of speculation, but I had to limit the book to what I knew were the major relationships. And so that's what I did.
Okay, fair. Yeah, making choices as an author.
Yes.
So I actually see on my screen, Julieta Almeida Rodriguez. Julieta, do you want to turn your camera on and ask your question?
She's in Portugal. Hello, Juliet.
Oh, hi, you can ask the question. It's okay.
I saw you on there. I didn't know if you wanted to. Me
okay.
asking all the questions gets a little tiring after a while. So, but I will go ahead. So it says, Nancy, congrats on your book. Were there any single women Ben could have dated after being a widow?
Well, I'm sure there were, because the French women were crazy about him. And when Madame Brillon turns him down for the last favor, he announces he's going to go, and he does, to salons and dinner parties and whatnot. And she becomes furious. And she says, you shouldn't be with them. You should just continue to be faithful to me. And he says, what's wrong at my age with me admiring other pretty women? He's quite bold about it. So yes, I think he did. But what he did, I don't know. I mean, the man is in his 70s. I don't know. Not to put anyone down in their 70s, but he's in his 70s. And I think his passion for Madame Helvetius, I think part of that was panic, which he often writes about being alone in his old age and having someone to care for him. So it may have been more on that level than it was romantic, although he certainly sounds pretty romantic sometimes. So,
great, thank you. Nice question here from Bill Ockester asking, what resources did you draw upon to learn the details of Deborah Franklin's life? And I think you've talked a little bit about that, but how do you kind of tell the story of someone whose papers seem to have unfortunately not survived on the level that we want them to?
Well, there are some reports of her personality from other people. And I'm talking now before the second voyage, before Franklin's second voyage, where we do begin to hear her voice. I'm so glad to get there finally. But there are reports about her, and one neighbor calls her a hedgehog. She's arguing about money with some neighbor. Somebody else, a young man who would come to try to get a position with Franklin, talks about her vitriolic temperament and her obscenities that he didn't expect from a gentleman. So we know there are other hints from other people that I did a lot of wide reading, and I also did a lot of reading about the small group of women who were entrepreneurial at that time in Philadelphia, and she was one of them, aside from all the postmistress and everything else she did. So you began to know more about her, and you also got to know a lot about her from Franklin's reactions to her in his letters. Sometimes he scolds her, or he gives her a command, or he asks about something and said, "You didn't tell me about that in your last, letter. Why didn't you?" So you begin to understand more about her before you even get to her voice. You see her voice once or twice. There's a few letters that are scattered in the Franklin papers earlier on when she writes. She says, "My master asked me to write," this was to William Strahan's wife, "to send books for Sally." So you see that she's already, you get that she's obedient as a good colonial wife would be.
There's a nice question here from Ken Romanowski asking, do you know if Deborah was involved with the Philadelphia women's movement to raise funds for the Continental Army in the 1780s?
Deborah dies in 1774, and she's been ill for a number of years. Her daughter, Sally, is very active in that, and actually is the person behind the creation of this whole committee of women who were making shirts during the Revolution, and so on. So Sally is the one who really is involved in that, not Deborah. But Deborah does defend the Franklin courthouse that Ben began to build as sort of a sop to Deborah before he left for the second voyage. She does defend the house at gunpoint during the Stamp Act riots. So she's feisty. I suppose if she had been living, she would have pitched right in with the rest of the revolutionaries.
Well, that strikes me as kind of a nice image to end on. A feisty Deborah defending her home and her property, and while Ben is on the road. Thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing this work with us. For our audience to know, Nancy, I think you reached out to us a while ago, maybe 2 years ago, when you were doing this, and I'm so glad that we were able to stay in touch and that we were able to help do this launch for this. I've saved the chat, so I'm going to send those questions along to you afterwards, just so you have them and can see all of our admiration for this work. Please, everyone, join me in a virtual round of applause to thank Nancy for this great talk. I see my great colleague, Michael Norris, has come up. Michael, do you want to have any sort of final word before we say goodbye?
Nancy, that was excellent. So thank you so much. And it was great to have such a good turnout. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you all. It was really great to be able to present and to hear your questions. And I hope you enjoy the book and maybe have a new view of Benjamin Franklin.
Absolutely. Thank you.